Okay, everyone. So now we're gonna start looking more at a real-world example of how to work with arrays and objects when they are combined, which they usually are. So an array containing a bunch of objects. In many cases, this is how you, for example, create customer baskets in web shops. I was thinking that we're gonna replicate a simple example of how we can basically add items and removing items from a basket, or basically adding and removing items from an array and then showing it here in the DOM by clicking buttons to add items and clicking another button to remove items. So without further ado, I will just jump down here, and I will start by creating a new array. I will call this adding array for adding items. And I will set this as empty to begin with. Then I will actually go over, I will save this, and then before I do anything else here in my JavaScript file, I want to go over to my index.html file, and I want to do a couple of things here. So I want two buttons, one button to add items to the array, one button to remove items from the array, and then I also want to be able to display the array underneath the buttons, or rather the items in the array underneath the buttons. So here, under this div that we created earlier here, where we output cars, see when we click this button, we output this cars array that we created in earlier videos. Up here, we have the cars array. So under this div here, where we output the cars array, I want to create a button that I'm gonna call add item, and this button is gonna take an onClick event, which is gonna call the add item to array function, which we haven't created yet, but which we will create soon. I also want a button to remove items from the array, so I will copy this and I will paste it underneath here, and I will change this to remove item, and I will simply call a function called remove item from array, which I haven't created yet either, but which we will do soon. What I also want to do is to have a div where I can display the array items. So under here I will create a div like this, and this div will take an ID, which we will need to be able to access it from our JavaScript. And I will give this array, this div an ID of array container. So if I save this and refresh, we should see that it pops up here. It's a little bit close there though. So I think that over here I will actually add a break tag, and then it should look a little bit better. Yeah, now we get a little bit more space there in between. Okay, so we have our array, which we don't see, but if I write something here and save and refresh, we see that we have it under here. So I will remove that. And we have our two buttons. So what I want to do now is that I want to create these two functions to add items to the array and remove items from the array. And each item I'm gonna add to the array is basically gonna be an object looking something like this. It's gonna have a name, and it's gonna be called like item 1, and it's gonna have an as well as an ID, which for example will be 1. So each object will look something like this. But we will create them on the fly while we click the button, or run the function, more rather. Okay, so I will start by creating this add item to array function, and I'm using I'm using arrow function syntax as usual. So I will call this function const add item to array, and this needs to be the same as the function name we're calling here, add item to array, and this is going to be equal to an arrow function. And what we want to do in this arrow function is that we basically, when this function gets run, we want to push on an item, an object which demonstrated into this array. And for this purpose, I will use the array.push method. So the .push method, which basically just you add on to the array like this, adding array dot push, and then here as the argument you specify what you want to push onto the array, and then what I want to push onto this array is the object. And now you might also be asking yourself why I'm not using the spread operator, which we've been using earlier, and which would be like doing something like this: const new array equals, and then we spread in the adding array and then add the object here instead. And the reason I don't do this now is that when I'm setting it up in this way with this adding array, is that I need to be able to modify and access the root array here, the adding array, and be able to push objects onto it and then to remove them from it. And therefore I cannot use the spread approach, since with the spread approach we're creating a new array. And the spread approach is still vastly usable, especially when working with frameworks like React or Angular or Vue, where you're having something called state, which we are not going to dive into. But when basically the DOM is updating all the time, then you can use the spread operator. But we won't use it here because of the fact that we need to be able to work with this source array that we're using here. So I will use this array.push operator, which basically has the same type of functionality. So if I would just write, for example, like this, item, and then console.logout adding array here, and open up the tools, and then refresh this, we can see that when we click this button, we see that we run the function and we have this item string in our array now. So that's how the push method works, and we also see that our add item to array function gets called. But this is not though how I want to do it, since I want to push on an object to this array. So what I will do here instead is I will simply create a new object, and this object is going to take an ID, and this ID I want to be able to change for every time we press the button, since it needs to be unique. So what I will set this ID to is that I will take the length of the array, the adding array dot length, length, which is now 0, and then increase it by 1 for every time I create a new object here. So every time we push this button and add an item, it's going to look at the ID and say, okay, the ID is set to the adding array.length, so whatever the length is. So if we have pushed in an item, so if it's 0 now to begin with, and then we push it an item, then it becomes 1. If it has 1 item we push in, then it becomes 2, and so on. So we basically increment this ID property here based on how many items there already are in the array. And this is not how you work with IDs later on in real projects and stuff. Then you have unique identifiers with lots of numbers and strings and dashes and so on. But this is for demonstrative purposes for how we can work with arrays and objects. Okay, so it has an ID, this object that we want to add to the array. It also should have a name, and this name I want it to be different for every item. So I would, for example, that the first item would be called item 1, and the next item we push on should be called item 2, and then item 3, and so on. So what I would do here is that I will use a similar approach. So first I will add backticks here to be able to use variable data within this string here. So I will write that it's going to be called item, and then I want to add a variable here where I want to say adding array dot length plus 1. So basically what this does is that it writes out item, and then it writes out exactly the same number as that we gave to the ID. So when there is 0 items, the first item will be called item, and then whatever this evaluates to will be 1. If there is 1 item in the array, the name property will be called item, and then the length, which is 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then it will increase like that for each item we add. So if I would console.log out the adding array here now, and we save, and we refresh, and I press this, then we see that we get here an item with the ID of 1 and the name item 1. If I press again, we see here that it console.logs out the adding array again, but now with 2 objects in it. And the first with ID of 1, name item 1, and the next one with ID of 2, name item 2, and so on. So now we have created a little function here for how to add on items to the array. What's not happening is that we're not displaying the array. So what I want to do after I've called this push method on the array and pushed on the object is that I want to run the document.get element by ID method, and here I want to specify the ID of this div that we created here, which is called array container. So we can copy it here, because here is where I want the array to be displayed. So I add that onto there. And then I want to set the inner HTML of this div here to this array. But what I want here for this array is that I only want to return an array that contains the name, since I only want to print out the name and not the entire object. So what I will do here is that I will take the adding array, and then I will use the .map, the .map method, which we walked through earlier, which returns our new array. And then for every item, I want to return the item.name. And then I will save that. And if we refresh this now, press OK, and then press add item, we see that item 1 comes up here. We press add item again. Item 2 comes up here. And then we press item again, and item 3, and so on. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is to make this button here do something. You see, if we click it now, we get this reference error remove button from array is not defined, and that's because we don't have a function created yet called remove item from array. So what I want to do here is that I want to create that function. And I will do this by basically writing the same way as with the add item to the array function. So I'll call it remove item from array, which is what we're calling here, remove item from array. And I will set this to an arrow function as well. And here, when I want to remove an item from this array, there is one very simple way to do it, is that I can remove every last item here from the array by using the pop method, which will just basically cut away the last item from the array. So I would, for example, use here just run adding array dot pop without any arguments or anything, and then console dot log out the adding array, and then save this, and then refresh this. So if we add items here, and then we press remove item, we can see that we get an array with just item 1. And if we add some more items and then press remove, you can see that 5 items are added, and then when we press remove, we get 4 items here. And then you would, of course, to make it show here, have to call the DOM again through the document.getElementById here, and update the array container with a new value. So basically just copy this method here and just paste it here in the same way. And if I would refresh this now and press OK, and I press add item, then I can add items, and when I remove, then it pops off the last item from the array. And this is all and good on how you could do it, but what would be more realistic is that we would look at the ID of the element we want to remove, and then remove the element with the ID corresponding with their own. And here, intuitively, you might want to use the filter method, but as the same with the spread method, the filter method also creates a copy of the array which we are filtering. So we're not filtering the actual adding array. So what that would mean is that we would not filter on the root array here. So after we've filtered it once, we won't be able to manipulate the adding array again, since it's not manipulated in the first place, but a new array has been created. And therefore, we can't use the filter method since we need to work with the root array in this case. And so that's what we're doing here with the pop method, for example. We're targeting the adding array directly. So what we could do if we would want to have this approach of targeting the ID instead is to use something called a loop and to loop over all the items in the array and then basically check the ID of the items and then remove the item with the ID corresponding to the ID that we basically want to remove. And the loops are something we're going to look at later in this course, but just to demonstrate how a more realistic example would look, I'm going to add this type of functionality here instead of using the pop method. So what I'm going to use here is called a for loop, and it has a syntax that looks like this. And the for loop, it takes an iterable variable, which you can name anything, but mostly you name it I. And it's responsible for iterate over or basically running a block of code that is within these two parentheses here for as long as a condition is true. And the condition here is the second thing we'll set. And this condition, we will say that run this code that we'll put in between here over and over as long as this iteration, the number of iterations that we've gone through is shorter than the length of the adding array. And you actually don't use commas, you use semicolons here in the for loop. And the third argument it takes is basically that you just tell the for loop that it should keep on running. So you increment this iterable variable by 1 for as long as this condition is true, which basically means just keep on running it. So what is it that I want to keep on running over and over? I want to basically go over this array multiple times to check the ID of every item. And then when I find the item that I'm interested in, I want to remove that item from the array based on its ID. So in this for loop here, I would set an if condition. And I would say that if the item of the adding array, which you can specify like this. So by setting this here, you specify that you're interested in a specific item in the array. And what we're interested in is each iterations that we have went through over the array. So you check this for each time we go over the array, we run this, which is what this iteration variable here represents. So for if this item here dot its ID is equal to the adding array dot length, so basically if the ID is 5, then that means that we have added 5 items and the length of the array is 5. So if the ID is 5, it means that the length of the array is 5. So if the ID is equal to the length, then we want to remove the item that has that ID, which basically then becomes the last item of the array. And what we're going to use here to remove an item from a specific item from the array we're going to use a method, an array method called splice, which basically removes or adds items to arrays based on the conditions. So we just take the adding array again here, and we hook on the splice method, and the first argument it takes is which item to remove, and that's basically this iterable item that we have specified. And if I save this, and if we refresh, we should get the same type of behavior as when we use the pop method, but now we won't just look at the always removing the last element. We will look at the ID and then see if that's the same as the length of the array, which in this case leads to the same behavior that we remove the last element. So if I refresh here and I add some items and I start, oops, here we got an error. I is not defined on 152. Const for we must specify to set that I is equal to something. So we set a starting point for I as 0. So the first, so it has a starting point for its iteration, basically. And if I refresh this now, and I add some items and remove, we forgot to set up the length parameter here and the condition as well. Sorry, you guys. Because we need to run this for as long as the condition that I is shorter than the array.length is true. So if we refresh this now, and we add some items again, then we see that we get the behavior that we also had with the pop method, but now based on looking up the ID. And this for loop and the loops in general will become much clearer in later videos when we will go over them more in depth. But for now, just know that this is a way of how we can work with arrays and removing certain objects from them.